Hello, my name is Aisha, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the last two projects that I've been working on. Um, I just wanted to talk about my paper dolls and my dress up game that I've been working on. I've have both of these projects finished. I'm finally done with both of these. I've been done with the paper doll one for a while, but the dress up game has just been recently finished. I just wanted to talk about a little bit of my process and just some of the things I was thinking about when I was making them. I really love fashion in the sense that I love putting together an outfit, but I wouldn't consider myself to be someone who spends a lot of money on clothes or fashion because I don't. I actually spend a lot of my money on other stuff like manga and figures and other things. But I really do enjoy like putting together a really nice outfit for a character, and that was like the whole basis behind both of these projects. So it was a lot of fun for me. I mean, there's some difficulties coming in where like with the paper dolls, you have to like draw certain outfits and like make sure that the outfits can be cut out. But then there's also the fact that like you need a cute outfit, you know, making really nice outfits and trying to see which combinations you could put together, what would look like a wardrobe for a normal person. Of course, they're like other people's wardrobes are a lot larger than a doll's, but that's kind of the reason why I wasn't able to like I put too many clothes in the both of these like concepts and ended up having no space for all of them. So in my attempt to make them more human, I made it harder on myself by spending way too much time on like making more clothes than was actually feasible for these projects. Which, like I said, was fun, but also very frustrating and sad when you can't like really even put it on, like you can't fit it into the project. You have to cut stuff out, literally, like you just can't put it in there. I'm thinking about in the future maybe adding the paper dolls to like taking the designs I use for the paper dolls and making that into a dress up game as well. But we'll see, you know, we'll see what the future holds because honestly, your girl is tired. The dress up game was probably the most stressful part of all of this, where I felt like the paper dolls was so much fun, adding this very like modern and also like 90s vaporwave style to paper dolls. Even though I know other people make paper dolls, I just like to add my little take on paper dolls, especially considering that like a lot of this is coming from memories of my own childhood playing with these. For the dress up game, I played so many dress up games as a kid as well, and it was so much fun, and I really loved it. And I think a lot more people resonated with the like dress up game versus the paper dolls. Where I feel like I resonate with the paper dolls because I went to average school. I didn't have paper dolls as a kid, but like I played with them. Where like everybody played a dress up game if you're my age, and if you haven't, you know, it's fine. But like most people have played a dress up game. The dress up game was a little bit more difficult because I was trying to either build something from scratch or I was trying to like use a website called Maker.io, which is a dress up game site. And I wanted to use Maker because they were easier to format. It laid out everything so simply. It was very easy for me to understand without having to like legitimately code. Where if making by scratch would require me to code, and I didn't really want to do that either. I wanted to have a like basis to work off of, like a base to work off of. And even though I was playing around with different bases, in the end I ended up having to stick with the Maker.io like idea of just working through that program. So the dress up game is up, it is running, and it is on Maker.io. There's a link in my bio if you want to go play that game. It is free, you don't have to pay for anything. And I do actually like Maker. I think it was a lot of fun like playing on the site on its own before I even like actually put anything on there. But it was also fun like designing the game if I was going to actually make it my own game, like having it like I had an idea of like putting on my coffee or something like that if I did, or putting on Itch.io. And even though that didn't work out, it still was a lot of fun making the background and working through like how to do lighting and stuff, because it gave me a lot of basically work to practice on. It was just a lot of fun working out all the kinks and the issues. Like I had some help trying to like find a program that I could use as a basis and program off of, and I made a lot of stuff around that. including this background, which I ended up having to cut a lot to fit into the Maker.io format. But it was originally supposed to be for like a different game style or format. And I don't feel like it was a waste or anything. It was a lot of fun making it, and honestly, I ended up making this twice. Like, I had to remake the background because I made it too close to the like, I guess you could say front or to the screen, and I had to like push it back a little bit so that you could see the character, instead of like the character having to be at her knees instead of like you see her feet. But if you look at the screen right now, like, you can see where I was going with the buttons. I was trying to make like an idle, there's like idle, hover, and selected. Those are the like features I had to design myself, so you can kind of see like the process of work that I was trying to do to make this my own game. I put a lot of work into it and a lot of thought, and it was really disappointing when I realized that it wasn't going to work, because essentially we had broken the game. That was kind of heartbreaking because we put so much time, like I was getting help to put time into like figuring out how this works, because I don't code, and you have to code a lot to like make the game work, and to have it not work in the end anyways, I felt like I wasted a lot of time. But then I also kind of learned about, like, if I wanted to try to make my own game, I could see how I could do it. But honestly, I would never like make a game from scratch like that. Like, I've thought about making a visual novel, but I don't feel like a visual novel is as hard to make as like a dress-up game, because there's so much information about it compared to like when I was looking up the dress-up games. But either way, I'm still proud of the work I was able to create. Like, you can see that like I basically created like different button functions where like the first one is idle, the second one is hover, and then the third one is selected. So basically, like, if you weren't touching the buttons, it'd be idle. If you were hovering over it with your mouse, it'd be hovering. And then if you were to click on it, like click on the button, it would show this color instead, or this like visual instead. I thought it was cute to add the little door, because the whole premise of the dress-up game was to be like, oh, I just feel like dressing up tonight, you know, it just feels like one of those nights. It's a girls' night in the house, on the couch. I just want to look good. So I thought I was like creating something really cute, and even with the clouds, like the original concept was Daydream Fashionista. That's like what I wanted to call the game. And I even made a mock-up for like the title screen. Like, honestly, I had a lot of fun making the dress-up game. Maybe a little bit more fun than actually making the paper dolls, because the paper dolls didn't really require as much outside of like me actually designing the outfits, where the paper dolls required me to like utilize so many different like techniques and understandings about how to present not image, but information. It was a lot of fun. I would say, like, I'm really proud of where I've gotten so far this year in terms of these different projects I've been working on. And I just wanted to share that excitement and share that process with other people, because, you know, like, these last 2 years have been really rough, and I've been just struggling with where I wanted to go with my work. And now I finally feel like I'm at a place where I feel more confident about where I'm going, what I'm doing. Even if I don't feel like I'm necessarily going anywhere, I'm just doing things. It feels fun, it feels invigorating, it feels like I'm actually being challenged and just more engaged with my work than I was before, where I felt like I had to perform a certain level of understanding instead of just understanding what I'm doing and just do it because I like it, because it was fun. And not to say I didn't have fun with some of the pieces I did last year, but this year it's not about presentation. It's just about, can I do it? Do I want to do it? Am I going to do it? Then I do it, and then here it is. You know, I'm just trying to take my time and make my own deadlines and pace myself the way I want to, instead of rushing to some end goal because, oh, I need to apply to this place. No, I need to apply to that. Nope, I'm just gonna do what I want. I know that seems simple and obvious, but it wasn't. Anyways, y'all have a nice day. Thanks for listening. Bye.